Okay, good morning. This is a Citizen Speaks, Stephen Polgar. Um, I would appreciate it if you clicked the like button and if you subscribed, making it worthwhile for me to do these videos. so, next section of history. George received the University of Pennsylvania fellowship, which provided the family with a modest income to tide them over until he was able to obtain his Pennsylvania medical license. That required the passing of the Pennsylvania Medical Board examination available to graduates of U.S. medical schools. The challenge was not so much with the substance of the examination, but its format. Having been out of medical school for more than a decade and a half, he not only had to review the general medical knowledge on which he was to be tested, but learn how to take the multiple choice written test administered to Pennsylvanian doctors. That was known as one of the hardest in the country at the time, but George's difficulty, like that of any doctor who studied in the Central European medical educational system, was with the format. The fellowship was a challenge for the doctor who had been practicing medicine for nearly 14 years, had written and published articles about about pulmonology during his years as a chief physician at the Freedom Hill Pulmonary Children's Hospital, and then worked as a pediatrician for the Red Cross in Austria. What made it even harder was that he was assigned as an assistant to a Dr. L, who specialized in the treatment of allergies and had a growing practice in an office attached to his home. George was placed in the basement of that house, next to where the dirty laundry dropped from a chute into baskets. If that wasn't demeaning enough, Dr. L was George's antithesis in the way he approached medicine and patients. In the thriving late 50s, when America was experiencing its post war economic expansion, and there were more and more people who could afford the novel allergy treatments that were being tested and developed as research at research university like Penn, it was a profitable business to be a doctor specializing in this field and treating private patients. George's supervisor was a good businessman, but not a medical research scientist, which was George's growing field of interest. To make things worse, George could not understand nor sympathize with the business side of the medical practice. He spent his years in medical training in a country in which even the best of the pre-war years, um, it was practiced a terribly limited form of free enterprise, circumscribed and regulated by government bureaucrats. Then the socialist communist system imposed its totalitarian control, persecuted and suppressed free enterprise, so that for a doctor it seemed incongruous to the practice of his craft. Even if ideologically he never accepted the denigration of capitalism, he did not see himself as a potential businessman. That made the 2 years in that 2 years that he spent helping Dr. L with his records and tests a torturous introduction to this kind of medical practice. It also contributed to his lifetime aversion to and avoidance of treating patients privately. Eventually, it took him 2 years of study and preparation to pass the certifying exam, and requirements of that placed extra stress on a family of five. Three growing children, with S, the oldest, soon becoming a teenager, made studying at home um, particularly problematic. Like his younger siblings, S couldn't comprehend how hard it was for his parents not only to adjust to a new life in a country so different from the one that they had to abandon, but to somehow manage to achieve some professional success. George had not only the abilities and the discipline to do that, but had already achieved status in Hungary, which provided him a goal to match or exceed. Catherine was not as well prepared to meet professional challenges because she had not had the opportunity to reach a level of success in teaching like her husband had in medicine. Her age and her role as a young mother placed great obstacles in her way. Overcoming these required not only her own strength and discipline, but help and support from her husband. George, so preoccupied with establishing his own status in the new country and approaching the trials and tribulations of his wife more as practical problems to be solved than as needing his emotional support and patient understanding, did not help her. Even more problematic was the way the children were treated in these trying and uncertain years. They knew nothing about social or professional status, nor care about such adult preoccupations. They wanted attention, affection, security, and the only way children conceive of these things. Little George turned 3 on September 2nd and needed the full-time nurturing of his mother. But 8-year-old Barbara and S, who turned 11 that summer, were in elementary school during the day. In the late afternoons and evenings, the family was together in a little 2-bedroom row home in the Philly suburb of Glenolden. The parents slept on a convertible couch in the downstairs living room, and George had to study for his exams after dinner. The older children didn't go to sleep until 8:30, sometimes 9, and kept the activity level as high as children are wont to do. After a year of struggling in the small house, the parents decided that they had somehow to diminish the complexity of the household. They found a boys' home on the shore of Lake Erie in Derby, outside of Buffalo, run by Piarist fathers for the children of refugee Hungarians. The solution to easing the cramped quarters of the family of 5 was to send S to this place for the school year. There were other refugee acquaintances who had become friends of the family who were also sending their boys to the school, so that S at first looked forward to going as if it were an adventure. At 11, he couldn't have anticipated the burdens and privations associated with living far away from his family in a community of boys. It didn't take him long to learn what these were, since the experiences quickly multiplied the further and the longer he was away from his family. The 2 years he eventually spent at the Piarist Boys Home became another life-changing event. He had to abandon his childhood home, its language and culture he had begun to learn. He now lived in a world where people, much freer to make choices and to rely on their own abilities, approached life in a radically different way. Now, at the onset of his teenage years, he was sent to live in a society of other boys under the supervision of priests. This is when a boy begins the transition to eventual manhood, struggling with new spiritual and physical problems. He began to search for directions, make moral choices, and seek ways in which to integrate into society. S had to accomplish this away from his parents and siblings. Despite the deficiencies of that environment, it was familiar. The illusion of security or protection from the evils of the world was nurtured there and provided him the strength to rather bear those ills he had than to fly to others he knew not of. Modified quoting from Shakespeare. Most importantly, as fraught with imperfections as family life was, his first 11 years had been spent with his parents and siblings. The family-inspired illusion that he was not alone was shattered in the communal environment with boys of ages 8 to 18, supervised by a priest and a young man. S began to learn how to live among strangers at the Derby home on the shore of Lake Erie, located on an estate generously sold at a modest price to the Piarists. Its main building, Graystone, facing Lake Erie, had been designed by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright and housed the priests and the dining hall. A newer one, a barrack of glass and cinder block, had been built behind it to house the boys. The destruction of the novelty and attraction of being away from his family and its limitations came with the discipline required to control a group of 25 boys. As had a previous unpleasant experience at a summer camp in Hungary, where he had to submit to group strictures. There he was the bourgeois kid whom the proles or prollies had bullied, with little protection from the supervisor, who may have been afraid to protect the boy from this politically exempted group. On the shore of Lake Erie, discipline was applied without prejudice. The requirement was that the boys had to accept strictures without question. The system was a pseudo-military one modified to account for the inability of especially the youngest to follow orders. The most basic routine was lining up to go to morning prayers, breakfast, back to the barracks, anywhere the boys went as a group. S was big for his age, so he was always placed somewhere at the beginning of a two by two line. He quickly learned how to comply with the orders of the person in charge. He was quick to stand still at attention, while the boys as young as 8 at the rear were still adjusting their positions, stopping their inadvertent movements, shoving, and whispering to each other. On one occasion, S scowled with impatience after many attempts to achieve the perfect 2 by 2 lineup demanded by the young prefect. S, are you bored? The prefect, standing slightly taller than him, bowed into his motionless, forward, frozen face. Yes, sir, S responded. Out of the line, he ordered. The rest of the boys were taken to the mess hall, and S was told to stand outside and wait. Soon an older, stocky, part-time helper who had been a gendarme in Hungary came out and asked him, Are you bored of lining up properly? He asked, looking over his drooping, gray-streaked mustache, still much the dour rural policeman who had had to enforce Hungarian laws more than a decade earlier. Used to the rough treatment of farmhands and countryside criminals, he tolerated no challenges to his orders. S, not understanding the man's intent, responded honestly, yes. He was told to leapfrog around a grassy knoll in front of the entrance to the Graystone building. The circumference of the grass-covered circular knoll was around 200 feet. It had rhododendrons growing at its center and a driveway encircling it. The driveway passed under the dark brown portico which formed the entrance. Circling the knoll, hopping, knees bent and hands pushing the ground between them, was easy the first 2 or 3 times. When S finished the last one, the man asked him the question again, and S, now in sheer defiance, answered as before. They continued this until the boy had circled the knoll 10 times, noticing that the man's impatience involved more than the need to break his defiance. So he responded to the question the same way each time. Then the man gave up and sent him on his way to the mess hall, since it was time for him to go home. Somehow the 11-year-old boy had discovered a flaw in the man's will to persevere. The pain in his thighs and legs was not enough to deter S, and his Pyrrhic victory reinforced his resolve. This had long-term effects on him, on how he was perceived by the prefect, and more significantly by Father K, the priest in charge of the care and discipline of the boys. It also taught the boys something about justice and fairness. Sometimes sacrificing your comfort and safety is better than submitting meekly to the capricious will of an unfair authority. If you're lucky and strong enough, especially in your adherence to what you perceive as just, you may win. No matter how taxing the victory, defending your God-given rights are more important than any other temporal gain. Father K and his young assistant H identified S as defiant and did everything possible to break his will. Preteen S, with a history of conflicts with his father, sought ways to circumvent the arbitrary military discipline, to his growing discomfort and with often painful results like those after frog hopping around a knoll. There were a few saving moments at the boys' home in Derby. Since S was big and strong for his age, he was often selected to help with tasks the smaller and weaker boys couldn't tackle. One of these involved the building of a fiberglass hull sailboat and the supervision of a priest not directly responsible for the boys in Derby. He was a science teacher at the prestigious private school the Piarist ran in Buffalo, and as most of the other priests teaching there lived in this comfortable environment that its wealthy original owners had built for themselves. Tall, dark-haired, he was an athletic and handsome man, and the gossip among the children, based on observations of his interactions with the women relatives of his students, was that he was a ladies' man. The contradiction of a celibate priest interested in possibly engaging in sexual encounters with his women and acquaintances was titillating for the preteen and teenage boys. Since no one attempted to disabuse them of these notions, they enjoyed elaborating and passing them on. Father M was a quiet, serious man, and as a science teacher, adapted learning the new technology of constructing a 20-foot boat hull from fiberglass. The tedious process involved spreading the knit sheets of blue-green silicon fibers over an old rowboat hull and then laminating each layer with the silicon-based liquid that eventually hardened and bound the sheet fibers together. Since the more sheets were used, the thicker and sturdier the hull became. The boys spent 2 months in late spring spreading the thick, sticky liquid over each newly spread sheet. Under Father M's careful supervision, they succeeded in completing the hull and then attaching it to a light wooden frame and seats. The sailboat, because of the lightness of the hull and its contents, had to have a keel inserted in its center to provide the counterweight necessary to support the sail and keep the boat from tipping over. When it was completed, the boys had worked on it, and others who wanted a sailboat ride launched it on Lake Erie. They enjoyed sitting in the product of their handiwork, singing sailor songs and skimming across the lake toward Canada. It was one of those memories that poised the counterweight to the more painful ones, but couldn't tip the balance against them. The pseudo-military discipline imposed by Father K was clearly intended to break the boys' wills, as S quickly understood. It may have had advantages in the training of soldiers who must suppress their individual needs and desires for the sake of their fellows in combat, leading to a greater chance of survival in the face of the enemy. For children as young as 8, it is merely arbitrary, and for most means an irrational attack on their building egos. Involved in the struggle to establish a self distinct from others, even the least perceptive saw it as unjust. S belonged to the older and more sensitive group of boys, and unluckily, in this environment, had acquired a sense of fairness, not just about how he, but even the others, especially the younger ones, were treated. That did no good for him, since it just led to situations like the one described above. Many years later, S wrote his first published story about one of Father K's punishment routines designed for the boys after they received their report cards at the St. V Parish Elementary School. S told the story so that his young hero, perceiving the priest's perverse passion for spanking the boys with a paddle, bore the whacks without a sound. He chose not to respond like his smaller, yelping fellow victims who were chased around the hall and beaten on their hands, protecting their backsides. When the priest finished beating S's buttocks, the boy stood up from the desk on which he had been made to lean and thanked the man. The enraged priest's face was red from the prolonged exertion it required to beat the children. His dark hair, usually combed to the right, had fallen over his broad, wide-cheeked face, and his dark, bushy eyebrows spread like the legs of an overturned caterpillar. The black cleric's shirt shifted so that the white collar was now an irregular, twisted rectangle with a wrinkled perimeter. He glared at the boy, his eyes reflecting a sharp, malevolent light. The boy, afraid and aware that he had provoked an emotion more dangerous than the one needed for the relentless beatings, looked away and headed back to his desk. He couldn't have understood the nature of the passion he had aroused in the man, denying him the satisfaction of the signs of suffering the other boys had so readily provided. Many years later, he understood what he had done and how he had conceived a propensity for resistance to authority. This was probably the most vivid expression of the evil in Father K that had lurked out not far below the surface and terrorized the boys under his supervision. The brutality expressed was beyond anything boys had endured, even the ones whose parents did not spare the rod. Though no different in its effect, beatings suffered at home were in a different category, since they were countered by signs of caring and affection impossible for the priest. He wasn't a father except an appellation, and the boys knew this. They were too young to comprehend the distinction between the types of corporal punishment, but aware of those between the fathers. In this conflict, Father K's perverse justice didn't break S. Instead, it inflamed his inclination to resist and lead to his finding the weakness in the man's spirit. Achieving his painful victory reinforced his doubts about the faith the priest represented. If this faith allowed such unjust and cruel punishment, there must be something wrong at its source. For an 11-year-old, it is almost impossible to dissociate such actions from the complex need identified as faith. As in so many of the confusing circumstances in his young life, he was provided with an antidote. He didn't understand it as such, but it ameliorated the doubts that the beatings conjured. The priest who eventually became the head of the Piarists in the U.S., Father B, became S's confessor. He had been one of the fathers, the possibly of encountering the many negative impressions and the resulting doubts in the boy's mind about Catholicism would have been drastically reduced. Father B, as S learned, also came from a Jewish family. The boy was only beginning to understand what this implied, and the knowledge that they shared this heritage reinforced his confidence in the priest. The contrast between his relationship to the two priests in Derby was to have a long-term effect in S's spiritual life. The prime subject of those confessions was S's growing awareness of sexuality and the need to satisfy the urge growing with the onset of his teenage physiological changes. What had started out as a vague premonition in Budapest, the mutual attraction between him and Pretty J had slowly developed into an awareness of masculinity, and even before reaching Derby, the discovery of masturbation to release the pressures of those urges. The conflict in the boy was created by the religious opposition to this common form of youthful release of sexual needs. The biblical story of Onan was one of the earliest to censure this behavior. Daring in Judeo-Christian efforts to come to terms with this most troublesome of animal urges, it was identified as a sin. To a boy of 12, the idea of sin was reduced to something bad, but why and how this was bad was beyond his understanding. Worst of all was the conflict between his perception of evil in men and the way that related to the satisfaction of these urges. Tackling the problem of this sin became the center point of S's confessions with Father B. The man tried patiently to guide the boy, but as with other sins, the source of the behavior required understanding to counter the compulsion. As a priest, he offered prayer and a search for grace. Though the boy understood the meaning of the words, he was focused on defining his identity, distinguishing it from those of the other boys and the men who supposedly had formed theirs. The role of sex and how to relate to this new drive was the hardest for the boy. It was as if an insatiable tiger had grown inside him. It slept most of the day, lying listlessly under a bush, only to spring out suddenly, without warning, and then there was no way to wrestle him into submission. It was a beast of beauty as well as terror. His black and yellow lines intertwined on his muscular body like writing in an unknowable language without words or sounds. His movements are unpredictable so that no enemy, especially no hunter, could possibly anticipate them. When he leapt high into the air to pounce on his helpless prey, he was so overwhelming that the victim cowered in awe and submitted to his fate. Being devoured by this beast was a pleasure whose magnitude could only be felt in contrast to the pain suffered after satiation. as the remnants of flesh and blood dripped from the tiger's long, white, stained teeth. His yellow-brown, hairy face and glaring eyes turned slowly away. He calmed down as quickly as he had been aroused and ambled back to his lair on big, soft, white paws. Disappearing was hard to trace. The source of this wild beast was beyond the boy's conception, and how it related to its objects was even more obscure. At this point in his life, he couldn't identify the girls or women who had any role in conjuring this overwhelming beast. Many years later, after much joy and pain, caused and borne, but especially after Grace, he could not have dreamed about at 12. He learned how to dissociate this voracious tiger from its indiscriminate targets. So that is the end of this particular section of Esther's history. Again, this is Citizen Speaks, and I'm Stephen Polgar, and I appreciate if you check the like button and if you subscribe to encourage me to continue providing these videos. Till the next installment, I wish you all well. Goodbye.